Hello, my name is Lisa Archibald, and I'm the director of the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Western University. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm also a professor and researcher in the speech-language pathology program with a particular interest in how children develop their language, especially in school-age children. Today, I'm going to give a talk on developmental language disorder, and I'm going to address the questions of what is developmental language disorder, and does my child have developmental language disorder? And I'm really pleased that you're here to join with me today. I'll just confirm that you can see and hear me. Sarah, is that true? You can see and hear my slides? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you very much. If you'd like to have a copy of the slides that I'm presenting today, you can use this QR code here with your camera probably to bring up the slides, and you can also use the link that is in the chat function today. If you have any questions about the presentation today, please add them to the chat whenever it occurs to you, and I'll take questions at the end of the session. I'll just begin with a land acknowledgement. Here at Western University. We're located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinookan nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Samba Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. And I'm a settler on these lands. So we're going to address those two questions. What is developmental language disorder? And then how might you know if your child has developmental language disorder? So let's talk first about communication. Overall, communication is a process of understanding and sharing meaning with one another, and it can come in lots of different forms. It can be spoken, it can be written, it can be signed, could be drawn, could even be danced. We could communicate with one another in lots of different ways. And we're going to focus right now on spoken methods of communication. And we can think in terms of two different aspects of spoken communication. One would be the speech part of spoken communication, and this refers to those motor movements that we make to sequence the sounds that put our words and our meaning together in our message. So it's got to do with the way the muscles and the structures are moving to make the words that we say. That's the speech part of spoken communication. And then there's the language part. And this refers to our ability to select and sequence words into sentences in a way that conveys meaning. So how do we know which words to use? And how do we know what order to put those words in? These are our language skills. So when we're talking, there are these two aspects of spoken communication: speech, motor movements, and language, words and sentences. So let's have a little practice and see what we think about some examples of whether the example is kind of a thing to do with speech or it's more of a thing to do with language. So let's start with supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, right? Lots of you will be familiar with that term from the Mary Poppins movie. And when we think about this, it's a funny kind of expression because it requires lots of motor movements, but it really has no meaning, right? Even if we say it fast enough and we sound precocious, it really has no meaning. And so it really is an exercise in speech motor movements that are not to do with language. All right, here's another one. With whom were you already in a meeting? Right? This is kind of a fancy sentence, and we might have to even think hard about the way we've put words together here to show that, yes, we've followed the conventional rules of word order for this language to say this sentence. With whom were you already in a meeting? So this is really kind of getting at the language skills behind the words that we're using. And here's one more. Don't cry over spilled milk. And so we can think about that. If you spill your milk, it might upset you and you might start to cry. And someone might say to you, don't cry over the spilled milk. But we know, when we know language really well, that that set of words carries a special meaning, right? It goes well beyond any instance of spilling milk. It's got to do with events that happen and that you can't take back. And so it's not worth being upset by them because they're over. So that set of words has much more meaning than just the words "don't cry over spilled milk." So that phrase, "don't cry over spilled milk," is really getting at language aspects of the way that we talk with one another. And so it's really language that we're focusing in on today. What is it about language and the way it develops? So let's speak first about language development itself. So language does develop, of course. We can start with infancy and early childhood, where babies are cooing and babbling, and eventually from that, first words emerge. And in this early stage of development, babies are developing vocabulary skills, word knowledge, and they're also developing some basic grammar of how to put words together. And then into childhood and adolescence, we see children build much more sophisticated language skills. So they refine their grammar, they're able to say much more complex sentences, they learn to read and write using their language skills, and they know how to use their language to accomplish lots of goals, right? So they can put together clever sentences that get their parents to do things for them, or get their friends to help them in ways because they know about the way language can be used. And then into adulthood, our vocabulary and knowledge is still growing. And sometimes based on the job that we have, we're learning very specialized language. We also have quite sophisticated language skills for things like extended conversation, for influencing others' opinions, for going to interviews, these sorts of things. And then into older adulthood, language is actually pretty stable during senior years, even though retrieving words that thinking of the word, oh, what's that word? What's that word? That can happen a little bit more to older adults. And it might be that processing speed slows down a little bit. But generally in healthy older adults, language skills remain pretty stable. Now, of course, in Canada and really in the world, lots of times the language is developing in the context of bilingualism. So people are learning more than one language. So let's think about that in particular. So when we're thinking about learning more than one language, we can think about total language knowledge. How many words do you know, for example? And if you're learning, so everybody who's learning language might be able to learn about the same amount, right? Let's just think about it that way. So that the number of words that a monolingual person knows is about the same as that of a bilingual person. But the words might be different. So if we take this example, you can see the monolingual person on your left knows lots of words in their one language. So the blue circle's pretty large. And if we take the bilingual person on the right, you can see that this person knows lots of words in one of their languages, the pink circle, and lots of words in the other language, more like the green circle. But if you summed all the words that are in language 1 plus language 2 for that bilingual person, the total number of words that bilingual person would know would be about the same as that blue circle for that monolingual speaker. So people have the capacity to learn lots of language, and they'll do so in the context that they're living in. And in this case, you might not even notice these knowledge differences. You might not notice that a bilingual child knows fewer words than a monolingual child, depending on how long that child's been learning both languages, right? And depending on other factors as well. Some children might know words in only one of their languages, depending on where they've learned the language. So if when they go to school, they use school words that don't happen very often at home, they might only know those words in the language of school, right? If they have some things happening at home that don't happen at school very often, they might only know the words that for home language, in the home language for those kinds of words. So we might expect to see differences in which kinds of words the child might know in one language or another. And we might see code switching, which is using a word from one language in a sentence that's spoken in another language. And that's very common in bilingual speakers across their lifespan. How much a child knows in each of their languages, their language 1 versus language 2, or if they even know more languages than that, will depend on lots of factors. So one thing is how often they hear each language and their own opportunities to use both of those languages. That will have an impact on the words that they know in that language. And also the language that they hear all around them. So the language of that majority culture. If they hear English all around them, then that context will help them to learn English if they're exposed to it. So that majority culture can also have an impact. But kids learn languages. That's what's really important to know, right? If kids are exposed to language, they will learn language to the best of their abilities. There's really no evidence that learning more than one language hinders language development. So if you have the opportunity to provide a bilingual environment for your child, you should go ahead, right? Even if you're concerned about that child's language development, you should go ahead and provide the kind of language context in your home that feels most right to you. Certainly, there are lots of benefits in our world to being bilingual. The other thing about language development is that language development varies. So here's an example of children who are 18 months. So children are 18 months old. On average, they have about 50 words. So we're somewhere here in the middle. But there are 18-month-old children who have 20 words. And there are 18-month-old children who have 200 words, right? Language development varies. And this is part of what makes it a puzzle about what this particular child's language development looks like. We know, however, that some children do struggle to learn language. So some children have a hard time figuring out the language that they're trying to learn. In infancy and early childhood, like I said, language skills vary widely. And we know that some children who were late talkers, that is, that they didn't develop their first words at a time that we expected, many of them will catch up. And that means that it's challenging to know which children may go on to have persistent language difficulties in this infancy and early childhood range. When children are getting older into childhood and adolescence, well, by about 4 years of age, we can expect many of those basic language skills to be clearly developing. And so around that time and older, we can see that if those basic language skills aren't clearly developing, that could be cause for concern. So it can be easier to tell which children are struggling with language learning once we reach around this age and older. Our question when we're thinking about children who are struggling to learn language is whether or not there's a persistent difficulty, right? Because I said children vary, maybe they vary, but then they do start to develop language well, and they go on to have language skills that are typical. But it's those children who have a persistent difficulty with struggling to learn language, 4 years of age, 5 years of age, older children, where we're saying, wow, this seems to be an inherent challenge for this particular child. And that's when we're noting the difficulty. So persistent is one thing that we're looking for when we're asking if this child is having a genuine difficulty learning language. And if that's the case, we might want to ask, is there any sort of biomedical explanation? So we know there are some kinds of biomedical conditions that have language disorder as a part of them. And if that's the case, if the child has a biomedical condition like that, then we might say that this child has a language disorder that's associated with that biomedical condition. But if it's not the case, that there's no biomedical condition a part of that child's profile, then we would say a child who's having difficulties learning language that's persistent over time and has no biomedical explanation, then we would call that a developmental language disorder? Developmental language disorder, or DLD. I've got a couple of videos in the presentation today, and I'm not going to play them as I go through first. I'm going to come back to them if we have time, but just in case there are more questions that you want to ask me, or if the content takes more time, I'm not going to stop now and play those videos. This first one shows what it's like to grow up with DLD. Let me talk about some facts about DLD. So we know that a person is born with DLD and that it persists across the lifespan. We know that it cuts across socioeconomic status. So children who are poor or children who are rich from homes that have range of socioeconomic status, maybe they have other disorders. DLD can cut across all of those kinds of conditions. The prevalence of DLD is about as common as dyslexia. Even though you've probably all heard about dyslexia and you haven't heard very much about developmental language disorder, still DLD is about as common as dyslexia. And it's 5 times more common than autism, right? So that might surprise you. Again, we hear lots of information about autism and not that much about DLD, but DLD is actually 5 times more common than autism. It's about 2 children in every classroom that we can expect to have DLD. And it commonly co-occurs with dyslexia. So children might have both DLD and dyslexia. The child with DLD will have key strengths because not all areas of their language will be impacted for all children. Every child with DLD will have some unique strengths in terms of their language skills, but they'll have also unique stretches or key stretches. Lots of individuals with DLD will have trouble learning words and grammar. They'll have trouble using their words and grammar in their talk, and they'll have trouble using words and grammar in different kinds of ways or more flexible use. Universally, across languages and countries, what you might see in this children is the use of generic words, simple sentences, and difficulties relating a past event. And I'm going to go through those in just a little more detail. All right, so let's do that. Let's get into a little more detail about what you might notice if you're thinking that your child might have DLD. So if we're thinking about relative to siblings, cousins, and friends, so the reason that we say that is because you're thinking about someone who's growing up in a similar kind of language context. If they're learning more than one language, if they're in a certain culture, if they're going to school in a certain place, what does, relative to those other children who are also developing language, siblings, cousins, and friends, what does this individual do in terms of their language? This individual with DLD, what you might notice. You might notice that they use simple words relative to those other children. So where other kids are using more specific words, individual DLD tend to use more simple words. So for example, a child with DLD might say flower when other kids are able to use words like rose and daisy and tulip. They might use words like it or thing, not very specific, for other words like bulldozer, for example. So they tend to use quite simple words when they're talking. They might also make simple sentences. So they might say, I see it, when other kids are saying sentences like, I see the baby playing with the dog, right? They are tending to use more simple sentences. They might tell you a story that it's hard for you to follow. So sort of, it's difficult for you to just know exactly what happened because that story isn't being told in a way that you can easily follow. You might find that you need to give lots of explanations and repetitions for the child to catch on to what you want to happen next or what you're trying to tell that child. You notice that you had to say it over, you have to say it again in different words, you have to show the child perhaps to get them to follow along. You might find that that child sometimes pretends to know what was said, even though you discover that they clearly did miss something. So they're sort of hiding those language difficulties. But these kids do talk, right? They keep on learning and their talking changes over time. So it's not like the talk that they're doing right now is the way they're going to talk forever. In fact, their talking will continue to grow, even if it's at a different rate from other children. So they'll keep on talking. And as they talk more, maybe other people won't even notice their struggles in language at all. Right? The other people will say, oh, I don't see anything, because the child is able to do the talking in that social environment that's required to participate. Even the individual, the child themselves, might not realize that it's language difficulties that are at the root of their struggles. So that when they have trouble learning something new, they might not realize that it's the language parts of those tasks that make it hard for them. And that's why we describe DLD as a hidden disorder that's not often recognized or diagnosed. Right? So it might be that some of you are older individuals, older children, even adults, and you might say, boy, this sounds like me, right? And it may be that you have never had developmental language disorder acknowledged in the struggles that you have. And we are working hard these days to find and identify children who struggle with language in this way and get them the support that they need much earlier on. So if you're worried that your child has developmental language disorder, some question you'll probably have is what causes developmental language disorder? And so I'll just say, we don't know. We do not understand the biomedical cause of developmental language disorder, at least at this time. What we do know is that there's no single cause. It's not this that causes developmental language disorder. Really, there are going to be lots of factors, all making pretty small contributions to the way this child's language develops and adding that this child's language developed and adding up to something. Sometimes that could be DLD, or it could be typical language development. There's lots of different genes that are contributing to the way language develops, lots of different environmental factors that are contributing. Some of them have protective factors, help that child's language to develop. Some of them might be risk factors that make it harder for that child to develop language. And it's all these things together that might have that child present with DLD or not. And we really can't predict. We can't predict which genetic and environmental factors are going to result in DLD. So we really don't know the cause of DLD. But I'll tell you something that we do know. We know that parents do not cause DLD. We know that parents do not cause DLD. Not in terms of the genes that they carry. There's just too many genes that are good for language development, maybe genes that are not, but you don't have all the ones that are poor. You have good language development genes, and it's not your particular genes that add up to this child having DLD. So that's not the reason your child has DLD. We also know that it's not in terms of what you're doing with the child. Right? There's nothing you're doing that's causing this child to have DLD. You're talking enough. You're talking enough for most kids to learn language. Right? Lots of kids learn language with lots of different kinds of talking models in their home. So it's not what you're doing with your talking that's causing this child to have DLD. Now, let's put that together with this. We might still ask you to talk more, right? But it's important to understand that when we ask you to talk more, when we ask you to explain more, or when we ask you to use shorter sentences, when we ask you to change the way that you talk to the child in some way, that doesn't mean you haven't spoken enough. It doesn't mean you've done anything wrong up to this point, right? You've been talking well enough for kids to learn language from the model you're providing. But now we have a child whose language development we're concerned about. And now we want to do a little bit more, right? We want to help those with DLD learn language more. And so that's why we might ask you to do something different with your talking, right? You're doing enough, right? When we say talk differently, it's not because you've done anything wrong. It's because we have an opportunity for this child with DLD to hear more language, to hear simpler language, to hear clear language, to hear grammatical models that they need to hear the kinds of words and sentences that will help them learn those next steps of language. All right. Well, what are the impacts of DLD? So if my child has DLD, what can I expect to happen? We use our language skills to do lots of things. And if your child is struggling with language, that might mean that they have more trouble with some of these tasks. So things like making friends, right? When I use my words to make friends with others, if I'm struggling with those words, that could make that challenging. It might be hard for someone with DLD to express their feelings, right? When we feel frustrated, we can start to put that feeling into words, and those words help us to get those feelings out. But if I don't have words, then I might use that energy with behaviorally. I might strike out, I might disengage, I might yell, I might do some sort of behavioral movements to express that emotion if in fact I'm not able to say the words to express it. The same with anger, right? If I can't put into words the feelings of anger, then I might see those feelings coming out in different ways in terms of behavior, something like that. And appreciation as well, right? Letting people know that you love them, letting people know that you like how they've helped you, right? These can be hard to put into words if you're an individual with DLD. School learning can be challenging for an individual with DLD. When you think about reading, when you think about language arts studies in school, clearly those activities all have lots of language wrapped around them, and that can make learning to read and learning to study our language arts challenging. But it's not just those kinds of activities. Think about math, right? There are lots of words that you need to tell people about what you need to learn in math. Lots of math concepts. If you think about word problems, when you go to the store and you have $5 and the thing you want to buy costs $2.50, how many can you buy, right? Lots of words wrapped around that math problem. Lots of meaning behind symbols, like a divided by symbol or a multiplication symbol, and we have to understand the meaning. So lots of words are a part of math, and the same with science and other aspects of the curriculum. And so school learning relies a lot on language skills. So school learning can be difficult for individuals with DLD. And thinking about those older adult skills, things like interviews, things like collaborative projects where I have to work with someone else in order to get something accomplished, right? These are all things that probably require sophisticated language skills and can be challenging for an individual with DLD. But I want to stress that some of the other outcomes of DLD, and this was work that was done in a review back in 2000, and what they did was they looked at the available literature from young adults with DLD when they compared them to peers without DLD. And they didn't find any differences between these groups, young adults with DLD and those without DLD, on a number of things. One was attending post-secondary school, right? Those with DLD went to secondary school at about post-secondary school at about the same rate as those without DLD. Now, when they got there, those with DLD did need more support. So important to recognize that, but they still went to those post-secondary schools at about the same rate. They tended to hold a job and have the same kind of job satisfaction as their peers. Those with DLD had about the same rates of having a job and having job satisfaction as their peers. Now, when they were on those jobs, there was more difficulty progressing through promotions within those jobs, but they held jobs and had the same level of job satisfaction. They got married at about the same rate as those without DLD, and they participated in social groups at about the same rate as those without DLD. So what we can see here is that We can hold our hopes and dreams for our children with DLD and see them have positive outcomes in their lives. Knowing that they have DLD gives us an advantage because it lets us plan for the kind of support that they might need across their lifespan. What you can see when we think about these impacts and outcomes is that, yes, DLD does have a continuous and diverse impact on life. So it has it presents challenges across language tasks that we encounter throughout our lifespan. But it's a disadvantage. It's not a disaster. Right? A history of DLD does not, of itself, predetermine outcomes. So if you find that your child has DLD, there's no reason to change your plans and hopes and dreams for that child because of that diagnosis. We do know, and what we can tell from this work, is that individuals with DLD need support at different life stages and for different language-related activities, even into adulthood. So we really do want to try to marshal supports for individuals with DLD across the lifespan. All right, I'm going to leave this video as well. I'll come back and show you these if we have time. All right, our next question, now that we've got a sense of developmental language disorder, I'm going to address the question of, does my child have DLD? And the best thing here to do is to see a speech-language pathologist. It's really a speech-language pathologist who has the expertise to help to decide about those language difficulties and the persistence of those language difficulties. And if you go to see a speech-language pathologist, you'll have an SLP assessment. And there'll be lots of things that the SLP is doing and talking to you about in order to help inform that assessment. So there'll be at least these kinds of 4 components: information from you, or teachers or clinicians, information about the child's talking in terms of their connected speech, observations of that child's learning, and standardized speech and language assessments. So let's think about each of those and how they might inform, we might use them to inform our clinical decision. So in terms of parents, teachers, and how the information that they might provide regarding this child's language development and whether or not this is a persistent language difficulty. First of all, we need to know how old the child is. We want to know about their home country or the region in which they've spent time developing. If there's trauma in that child's history, that could be a factor in the way that that child is developing. We want to know what languages are spoken around the child, how often they're spoken, how much the child is engaging with those languages. We want to hear about what you've been noticing in terms of the child's language development, in terms of the words and sentences the child is understanding and also using when they're talking. And we'll ask you about some other general developmental indicators. How are they doing in terms of their motor development and other areas? So a big part of the speech and language assessment is what parents and others who are close to the child tell us about the way this child is developing. We'll also listen to the child. So we'll get some connected language from the child. We want to hear that child talk in an extended sample of that child speaking. So we want to engage that child in conversation. We'll try to ask that child to tell us a story. We might show the child a book and ask them to tell, or show them a picture and ask them to tell us a story so that we can really get a full sample of that child's talking. And we'll want to observe that child in situations where they're likely to be using their language. So observations of play or classroom participation will all help to tell us about this child's language development. And then we'll do some standardized assessments of language components. I'm going to talk more about what I mean by standardized in a moment, but these will be language tasks that we commonly use with all kinds of kids, right? So we see children many children do these kinds of tasks. That's part of a standardized assessment. And it could be in a number of areas, and we will be looking at a number of areas across this child's language development. We'll be looking at the way that they make speech sounds or their phonology. We'll be looking at their sentence structure. We call that syntax. How do they put sentences together? We'll be looking at the words that they know and how it connects to their world knowledge. So their word and world knowledge, that's called semantics. We'll take a look at how easy it is for them to recall the words that they do know, their word finding skills. We'll look at how they use their language skills for social interactions or pragmatic skills. And we'll consider their verbal learning and memory. So what might this look like? So let's just take some examples of what common kinds of tasks we might be using to assess these kinds of things. So here's an example of how we might assess word knowledge. So I might show you a choice here, and I might say, point to the donkey, right? And you need to understand the word in order to respond by pointing to the correct picture. And you're demonstrating then your knowledge of that word. I could ask you something like, what's one word that could stand for everything on this page? So do you have that superordinate category, that word fruit that could cover all of these things, for example? I might give you a sentence. So here is a picture, and we might say, they're finished, right? Or we might say, he's finished. And you would point to the picture that shows that shows your understanding of that sentence. So, and I might manipulate there whether I'm saying this in indicating more than one person, or what tense, if they started, are they currently swimming, or are they finished, for example. I might also assess grammatical knowledge and things like this one. I might say here, I might point on the left and say, here is one hat, and then to the right and say, here are two, and leave that hanging and ask the child, or wait for that child to supply the word hats, right? So that child would be indicating to me that they figured out something about language. They figured out that by attaching that sound at the end of that word, that they're changing the meaning of that word. They're making that word now mean more than one hat. And so that helps me to know that they're figuring out the grammatical knowledge within that language. I might say, every day she jumps on the left, and here she is today. She has already, and wait again, and look for the word jumped, right? Where that t or that ed ending, if you're thinking of words, written words, rather than the sounds that are happening at the end of jumped, then that's signaling that the action has already happened. And when I use that form, I'm indicating to you that I figured out something about the language that I'm learning. And then I might assess the child's connected speech. I might ask them to make a sentence, make a sentence with the word when, for example, and I might carefully choose those words that I ask the child to make up the sentence, so that I get more complex sentences or make more challenging sentences, as opposed to simpler words that would be easy to put into a sentence. So that I can really kind of fine tune the kind of sentence that I'm asking the child to make, and show me how they're able to use the words that they know, or tell a story about a picture. All right. So those are the kinds of tasks that the child might be doing in an assessment with a speech-language pathologist. And I mentioned that they would be standardized tasks, or they're usually standardized tasks. And so what do I mean by that? Beyond that they're common tasks, that we use these tasks a lot. Another thing is that these are tasks that have been done by a large group of individuals. So we got a whole lot of kids to do that. And by getting so many children to do those tasks, we can establish the most common responses to items. We can say, wow, all kinds of kids do this when they see that item. And we can see what age levels we see changes at. Young kids still not, on average, they're not doing that. These older kids are doing that. These even older kids are doing something else, right? This becomes what is called the normative group. So the normative group tells us, on average, at what age kids are doing what kinds of things in these language tasks. And that's becoming standardized then. And now I give these tasks to a particular child, a particular individual, and I see how they do on this task, and I can compare them to that normative group. And I can ask, is this child's performance substantially lower than the normative group? And if it is, then that might indicate learning challenges. So you've probably all heard about the bell curve, right? This is a norm reference curve. That's what standardized is really getting at. And I can tell when the child scores in a certain way, whether they do that in the way that is in line with that normative group, so within the average range, or whether they do more poorly than that normative group, more poorly than I would expect, or even better than the normative group, stronger than the normative group. And I can say, oh, this child's language skills are below what I would expect. And that would be some important evidence about that child's language development. Now, who can see a problem with that approach, right? These standardized tests, right? I bet you can, right? So a problem with a standardized test is that that normative group, that large sample of children, might not always be a good comparator for the child that I'm seeing in my office, right? If I had all the children in that test were monolingual, and I'm now assessing a child who's bilingual, if all the children in that normative group had lived in a culture with a majority language, or they all spoke the majority language, and I have a child in my office who's speaking in a language that's not the majority culture, then that means, how do I interpret this child's score relative to that normative group when that normative group isn't really a good comparison for that child? Well, it's a number of solutions that we try. First of all, ideally, we might have a test in that child's language, right, that we could administer. But I'll tell you that that's not all that common, right? So many different languages, children are coming in, so many different pairs of language that they might be learning, that we really often don't have a standardized test in the other languages that the child is speaking. So some things that we do are we accept the test responses that the child gives in any language that the child speaks. Remember, way back, I talked about the total language knowledge. So if the child knows the response in another language, then I can give credit for that, even though I might have expected it in English, for example. But if they give it in another language, then I can give credit for that, and I can use that to score. I might have translators work with me to help me administer some items that are somewhat similar to those that are from the standardized test, and then I can compare. When they do it in their home language, they're able to show those kinds of skills, even though on the standardized tests in the language they might not know as well, they didn't. And that can help me learn more about that child's language development. I might listen to you, your parent, or peers of this child who are from that same cultural linguistic context, and do some of the same kinds of activities, right? So let's say I asked you to repeat a sentence and I listened carefully to what you did or the child's peer, and then I might ask the child to repeat the sentence, and I might say, yes, I can hear that those are different, or I can hear that they're really very similar. That might help me decide about that child's language development. I may do some work teaching the child something that they didn't seem to know in the standardized test. But I say, well, maybe they just don't know it because they've never had a chance to learn it. So I'm going to teach it to them now, and I'm going to see. I'll come back later and I'll try again. And maybe the next time after I've taught it to them, they show me that, yes, they've got it, right? And so really they show me that they're able to learn language when they're provided with that kind of specific teaching. All of these things can help me decide about the bilingual child's language development, even if the standardized test is not going to be a great comparison for them. All right, and that's the kind of approach that the speech-language pathologists will use in assessing your child. They're looking for this converging evidence, right? They're looking for evidence from you, from what they see in the child, from the talking that their child, from the observing the child, from the testing that they're doing, to come to a clinical decision about whether or not this is developmental language disorder or some other communication difficulty. And those clinical decisions can be challenging. The work that I'm doing in designing the DLD diagnostics toolbox is meant to be for speech language pathologists to help guide them in making those clinical decisions, and to do that around the world. So everyone in the world has access to the DLD diagnostics toolbox and can use it to inform their clinical decisions, so that we hopefully get more and more consistency in the way that that child is producing or in whether or not this child might have developmental language disorder. So if you're interested in the question of whether or not your child has DLD, ask your speech language pathologist the question about whether or not they have DLD. Does it help you to know your child has developmental language disorder? Is this something you want to know? Is it a question you want to ask? So let's think about that. It might help you. It might help you to know your child has DLD. It might help you to understand your child's struggles. It might help your child to understand their own struggles. It might help you or your child identify strategies that help them the most. It might let others know about the struggles that your child is having. It might let others know about the strategies that can help them. You might find, and your child might find, others who have similar experiences. If you're someone with DLD, you might find someone else who has DLD, and that might be helpful to you. Are there services for your child with DLD? So that's a challenging question, because we still need more services for those with DLD. At this point in time, here in Ontario, you can access preschool speech and language services to be able to speak to a speech language pathologist about your child's language development. And in your schools, you can ask your child's teacher, to access speech and language services in order to see what can be done to support your child's learning in the classroom. There are, of course, also private speech language pathologists who provide these services as well. So let's just finish up with just a couple more comments about how we can help, and then I'm happy to take any questions. So an important thing to remember for the child with DLD is that all the communication problems that your child might be having are not their problem. Not just their problem, right? It's not just them. It's really everything around them that's making language difficult for them. So how can we think about supporting that child and making that child's environment more accessible to them in terms of language? So we can think about ways that we can provide a language or an environment that encourages this child's language, as well as supporting the child's language development as well. So we can use accessible language. We can provide explicit supports. We can support reading and writing, and we can address self-regulation and self-advocacy. So in terms of accessible language, right, we can slow our words down, emphasize important words, provide some visuals, repeat our instructions, and give that child lots of time to respond. In terms of helping the child develop their own, making ramps like we do with wheelchairs, making talking ramps so the child can engage in talk. We can explicitly teach words and concepts that our child needs right now, right when they need this word, give them an explanation. Teach the words in the languages the child is learning. So teach them in school language as well as home language, so they really do know that word. Give them lots of deep understanding. Explore that words. Give them related meanings, simple definitions, pictures, connections to written forms. And incorporate lots of opportunities for repetition. There's some research that suggests that those with DLD need 36 times, 36 repetitions of a word to really take it on. So there really lots of repetitions is important. And opportunities for extended talk with you. So book sharing, or what we call dialogic reading, where you choose a book that includes words and concepts that your child might need to be talking about, and emphasize those new words when you're reading. and use your questions to discuss the story as you go, talk about the meaning, help the child see connections to what's in the book with what they are learning in their everyday life, and really extend their thinking. What would happen if, right? Here's a nice little video you can watch on your own as well. Talk about the book after you finish, extra textual talk, right? Have conversations about the book and help that child really understand the story. Support reading and writing. That's a part of language too, right? Word recognition, understanding the words that are read with language comprehension. That's what gives reading comprehension. So those language skills are important to reading as well. And then self-regulation and self-advocacy, helping your child understand about their own DLD, how to tell others about the strategies that will help them, how to use their words for learning in school and for social interactions. And these are a couple of videos that my students have also done that talk about how to equip children with the knowledge that they need for self-advocacy and for learning in the classroom. Lots of other resources are in that slide deck, and maybe I'll just ask Sarah to post it one more time so that the link to it one more time so that you have it if you need it. There are lots of resources about DLD at these websites here. We've written a very short article for kids about DLD and Frontiers in Young Minds, and you can find all my students' projects at the link there on that slide. So I want to thank you very much for your time today. And if you want to contact me, you can do so at these connections. So thank you very much. I'm going to go back and take a couple of questions that came up during the talk. And so one was about biomedical explanations. So things that might be associated with development or with language disorder. For example, an intellectual disability often has a language disorder associated with it. If there's a biomedical condition like that, then we would say that language disorder is associated with that biomedical condition. And then here's a question about, should a child with DLD have an IEP at school? And if they already have an IEP, should DLD be listed as part of its identification? So in the school system, they will be focused on that child's school learning, and that's what will drive the use of an IEP. And so if the child's learning challenges are recognized, then they'll be at the IEP, then that's what will drive that IEP. The recognition of the child's learning challenges as being related to language is an important piece, in my opinion, to include in the IEP. So this is where recognition of DLD can be helpful, because the learning challenges we're seeing at school may very well, or are likely being fostered by the presence of DLD in those that have DLD. And so this is where we're really aiming for DLD to be meaningful in these contexts. So teachers say, here's a child with DLD. I know the strategies that I need to help that child learn in my classroom. And so recognizing the DLD in the classroom is, in my opinion, important. So here's a question about the question of that total language piece and how we might count up bilingual words. And so in many ways, we would count words that even the child knows two different words for one item, right? So how, do we give the credit for this? So here's the word cup. So do we say, the kid knows the word cup? Or do we say, the kid knows the word cup, and they also know another word, task, for example? And in most cases, we would consider that as part of that child's total language knowledge, right? It can depend a little bit on how close those two words are, whether we're seeing those being two, but most of the time we would say that those are both part of that child's language. And here's a question about the relationship between comprehension and speech. So these are two different things. Comprehension is part of our language. Do we understand the words? And speech are those motor movements. So does the language piece have an impact on the speech piece? And so It does, right? So those speech and language are developing hand in hand. And if my speech production is weak, I'm making speech sound errors, then it might be the case that the way I'm learning words is not as well, then my knowledge of that word is lower. I don't understand where all the sounds in that word are because I'm not producing it as well. So that can be connected. It's not a one-on-one thing, right? We don't necessarily say, oh, because your language is impaired, then your speech is going to have an impact. So, but we can see them as linked. So I hope I'm not sure that that answer was just as clear as it could have been. All right. I think I've addressed all the questions that have come into the chat. If there aren't any more, I thank you very much for your time today. And thank you for being a part of our May is Speech and Hearing Month.